Hi, welcome back to Not So Obvious Watches. I'm Pete McConville, coming to the end of the year. So as traditional, let's do a bit of a retrospective, a look back. What am I going to talk about today? I'm going to talk about the watches I think are the most interesting watches of this year. Some of these were pretty hyped, most weren't. Most of these are not really going to make that much of a splash, although I'd hope some will. But I think what's in them and what they're doing and what they're saying and what they may show for the future, or the questions that they raise and make us think about, make these the most interesting watches of 2021. Anyway, let's get into it. Okay, you know what? I'm not going to start somewhere obscure. Let's start somewhere obvious. I think that one of the most exciting watches of this year, certainly one of the most interesting, is the Tudor black base ceramic with the Metas movement. I rarely put a Tudor on my most interesting anything list. But the first thing is, I'm biased because I love this watch. I think this is a killer. I'm not a big fan of Tudor, but I've done a whole video about how if I was going to buy one, it would be this watch. But none of that is why I make it the most interesting watch, one of the most interesting watches of this year. The reason why this is on my list of one of the most interesting, because it's doing something really important. It's a follower. Funnily enough, it's really trendy and it's really fashionable, and it's kind of the thing to do, to always praise the first person to do something. But often the single most influential person, the most important thing for any movement is not actually the leader, it's that first follower, that first person. If you've ever seen the video of a guy who stands up and starts dancing and like no one does anything for like 5 minutes, but then a second person starts dancing and within seconds, suddenly all of this erupts. That's what the Tudor black base ceramic with the Metas movement is for me. It's the watch that follows Omega's move with the Metas certification. For me, it's the watch that indicates that what was previously something confined to one brand that wasn't going to break out, might just break out, might just start a new fire, start a new certification basis, start something new in the watch community. And so whilst Tudor doesn't get the credit for inventing Metas, for making it big, for getting it on the stage, by being second, by being the follower, the Tudor black base ceramic could be the one that paradoxically makes Metas. And for me, that makes it one of the most interesting watches of this year. Okay, so my second interesting watch of this year is the Fortis Marinemaster. It's why the Fortis Marinemaster? I think the reason why I'm finding this interesting is because Fortis had already started down this path, but more than anything now, Fortis is doing something interesting. It's taking a watch brand which had a defined place as entry-level, just another Swiss watch, just another mediocre, nothing particularly special watch that will eventually drift off into obscurity and eventually close. In fact, Fortis came really close to doing exactly that. And then it got bought, and it didn't get bought by someone who said, you know what, we'll just pump a little bit more in, hold our breath, keep going and see what happens. Fortis have taken a brand which was, if not dying, then certainly moribund, and rather than just try to keep breathing, they've tried to grow and become something perhaps more than they've ever been. They've started coming up with new watches at a whole new price range with more expensive options, more exciting and innovative designs, more passion, more excitement than they've had for, if not ever, then certainly for a long time. Whereas everyone else that's doing that is kind of like trying to create either whole new brands or reaching back and finding very, very old names and then resurrecting them after a long gap. What Fortis is trying to do is take an existing brand that is out there and in the market and was trading one way just a few months ago and turning it into something completely new and at a much higher level with a very different design, and trying to sort of sell an entirely different view of themselves. And the Marinemaster, parts of this came through with the earlier Flieger, but with the Marinemaster, this really smashes home. This is not a straightforward diver. This is not a hardcore tool watch. This is not some sort of engineer's pet project. This is fashionable and colorful and blurs lines between genres. It looks forward with a whole range of things. In many ways, it's something Fortis hasn't been in the past. Will they pull it off? I don't know. But if they do, if Fortis show that these kind of moribund, ossifying brands that are hovering at the fringes of survival down at the really low end can reinvent themselves as mid-tier, $5,000-$6,000 watches and be successful, then what Fortis is doing could be really exciting, could usher in a whole raft of, it could lead the way for a number of brands to do the same thing. Will it happen? I don't know. Probably not. But the Fortis Marinemaster shows us that it could. And for me, that's why this is one of the most interesting watches of this year. Okay, so my next interesting watch of this year is another one that's probably not that obscure. It's probably pretty obvious. And that's the Grand Seiko White Birch. So why do I think this is interesting? I think this is, for me, it's interesting because of a couple of reasons. First, it is it's Grand Seiko doing Grand Seiko, the dial and the Zaratsu finishing and all of that thing, like it had done on the Snowflake and a couple of other watches. So in a way, maybe it's nothing special. Maybe it's just another Grand Seiko. But for me, up until now, all the buzz, all the excitement around Grand Seiko had been confined to spring drive and their 9F quartz movements. They were kind of like the calling card for Grand Seiko, and that was great for people who liked the 9F quartz and who liked spring drive. But it was also really clear that there was a great chunk of the community that didn't like those technologies, who wanted their good old everyday, well-known, traditional, automatic watches with, a plain old everyday mechanically working escapement. And what the White Birch did was it expanded Grand Seiko into that space where they'd been before. It wasn't their first automatic movement, but it was the first of those kind of big, hyped, really exciting Grand Seikos with the mechanical movement. And I think in a way, the White Birch is the watch for me that says from Seiko, we can do high tech, we can do quartz, we can do spring drive, and we can do traditional, straightforward mechanical movements. We've got all bases covered. We've got a watch for everyone, regardless of who you're at. For me, the White Birch was the watch that says Grand Seiko means business. They're not here to be on the margins and everyone's second favorite brand. They are meaning to own the field. And I thought that was pretty interesting, and hence it made my list. Okay, so the next really interesting watch for me this year is pretty obscure. It is the Ulysse Nardin Torpilleur. Okay, so why is this interesting? On one level, it's interesting to me because marine chronographs are not a field of watch that gets a lot of coverage. Pilot's watches, chronographs, dive watches, they all get a lot of coverage. Very few marine chronographs. And the Torpilleur style and look, and the Ulysse Nardin history in marine chronographs that all comes through in these. I thought that was interesting to see a mainline brand starting to sort of play in that space. That last phrase is also interesting to me, a mainline brand, because that's not Ulysse Nardin. They are a reasonably big brand, they're in the top 50, they do pretty well, but this is the second reason why I think this particular watch, the Torpilleur, was interesting to me, because the coverage of this watch was normal, was ordinary. It was like as a good quality watch from a well-restricted brand would be treated well and with respect. That's not something Ulysse Nardin gets very often. As a brand, Ulysse Nardin is kind of all edge, no center, all highlights, no base. You've got the Freak and the Blast and those weird erotic watches sort of on one edge. And then you've got the Divers with their very straightforward third-party movements, nothing particularly exciting going on, which don't seem like, which aren't the good core for a brand like Ulysse Nardin. There's sort of high-end horology. And so as a result, the brand has always felt hollow. But with the Torpilleur, I think we can see Ulysse Nardin starting to fill that center in. That watch, that family of watches, and the way it was received and the way it was spoken about, to me indicates that maybe Ulysse Nardin have realized that they need to be more than just the edge. They need a center. They need to be more than just, the lead guitarist. They need a bass just driving them along. And the Marine Torpilleur, with its movement, with its design, with its sort of everything about it, could be like the Big Pilot for IWC, could be like, that core flag in the ground that sets the center of Ulysse Nardin and would provide a much more solid foundation for all of those other watches that so far have kind of failed to really grab a base, grab a community. And for me, the idea that a great and storied brand, a brand that has every right to be sort of at the forefront of watches, may well have found the collection, may well have found the watch to move them forward, is interesting. And that it's also in a marine chronograph, which is not a watch we see a lot, I thought was worth talking about. Okay, so my final watch, which makes my most interesting release for this year, is the Citizen Mechanical Caliber 200. Why? Because Citizen is a fascinating company. It is clearly the best known unknown watch brand in the world. They are huge. I believe they sell more watches than anyone else. And yet, amongst the enthusiast community, they are essentially a non-entity. They barely get a mention. I should say amongst the enthusiast community in the West. In Asia, they have a very well-known and very well-respected high-end area that doesn't really make it to the West, that doesn't seem to cut through. And for so long, I've looked at Citizen and wondered, are they ever going to try and close that gap? Are they ever going to try and take their power and their gravitas and their profile from the East and bring it into the West? And if so, how would they do that? What would it look like? I think it looks like the Mechanical Caliber 200. I think that's it. And for me, this is an interesting watch because it seems to indicate Citizen might actually be going to try and become an enthusiast brand in the West. It might actually try and be more than it can be. And that for me becomes really interesting on a whole range of areas, because suddenly not only does it mean Citizen can come across, but what does that mean for all the other brands that they use. I note the Caliber 200 is a Le Jour base movement that was developed for Citizen at their behest. What does that mean? Does that mean Le Jour is going to get more input? There's going to get more money? Is that a movement that's going to become available to other people? What does that mean for Frédéric Constant, Alpina, Boulevard, that are all owned part of the Citizen group? Is this confined to just the Citizen brand, or is the Citizen group waking up and going, we can be more, we can do more? I don't know, but the idea that they might is really exciting. And if that happens, I reckon that when we look back to try and figure out what was the spark, where was the moment, when did the tide turn, it would be the release of the Caliber 200. And for me, that makes it one of the most interesting watches of 2021. Okay, so that's it. They're my 5 most interesting watches of 2021. What about you? What do you think are the watches that are really interesting? In particular, what do you think are the watches that maybe we didn't pay enough attention to, but we should, because they ask us an interesting question, or they say something about where we might be going that a lot of people haven't picked up on? Anyway, I've been Pete McConville. This has been Not So Obvious Watches. Give this video a like and subscribe whether you liked it or not, because you're just going to make me happy. I'll see you later. Bye.